Gaslight pooled like melted gold along Jackson Park, as if the lake itself had decided to glow for mankind, and the White City answered with a million incandescent points that made night feel newly invented. Isabela II stood beneath the long cornice of the electricity building, hands bare despite the October chill, reading the faces that came to be dazzled. Diplomats, smoothed silk lapels, shop girls in their Sunday dresses, craned up at the vaulted ceiling, where dynamos purred like stabled beasts, and farther off on the Midway Plaisance, the Ferris wheel lifted couples into the sky with a confidence that felt vaguely imperial. She was 25, crowned by the age, and yet crowned more severely by its impatience. In her pocket lay the decree she hoped never to sign. In her throat, a promise she'd made privately to her own reflection. If light is power, then let it answer to the people. She had not yet spoken it aloud. She would before the week ended, and the nation would hear. It began with sparks and applause. In the center nave, where banners announced Westinghouse alternators and Edison dynamos, like rival princes at a joust, Nikola Tesla prepared his demonstration. He wore black, like a conductor, and stood with the grave amusement of a magician who disdains mystery. The showgirls cleared, the reporters elbowed forward, and the orchestra hushed to a whisper of bows. "Observe," Tesla said, and the coils sang. Blue fire climbed glass, and a wreath of electrical flame spread around him so gentle it kissed his fingertips. Isabela watched the crowd lean into the miracle, as if to enter a chapel. It was why she had insisted that the world's Columbian Exposition risk its soul on electricity, because no scripture could command hearts like a skyline of lamps answering a switch. Across the court of honor, where the alabaster facades pretended perpetuity, men whose money rooted under LaSalle Street sipped their cigars and pretended not to count the crowd's gasps. Isabela recognized two of them by silhouette and posture: the chairman of a telegraph trust with a grin like a crease in metal, a banker whose waistcoat seemed starched with collateral. They nodded to her with ceremony, like courtiers at a masque, and resumed their murmurs. It pleased her to be underestimated. The White City, with its clean lines and false immortality, had taught her the danger of surfaces. Tesla's second switch lifted a floodlit ocean over the room. Alternating current flowed from Westinghouse generators to 1,000 filaments. Across the aisle, the Edison dynamos answered with their primeval hum, low and exhausting, direct current shouldering its labor like a mule. The yellow press scribbled metaphors, as if the very ink were stabilizing the century. Hearst's man stood on a crate, hissing at a compositor. Pulitzer's boy counted syllables, and somewhere behind them both, a woman with a pen behind her ear and a threadbare shawl over her shoulders took notes as if she were storing gunpowder. Isabela noticed her because the woman watched everything: the copper smell in the air, the way the arc lamps popped like applause, the unblinking concentration of the engineers. Later, Isabela would learn her name: Ana Delgado, barista by morning, costurera by night, and today a vendor at an arcade cafe, where fairgoers paid in small stamped coupons for bitter coffee and sweet coins of pastry. For now, Ana was a face that did not fit the prearranged tableau, and that made Isabela's attention return to Tesla, even as she memorized the woman's slanted note hand. A whistle cut the rustle. Someone had pulled a fire signal. On the south wall, a small transformer, new, experimental, chattered. The sound was not right. Tesla's head snapped toward it. Westinghouse's men stiffened. The transformer should have purred. Instead, it squealed in a frequency just above hearing, like a mosquito's refusal. Tesla moved without ceremony, lifting a panel. The arc went bronze, then green, and then the sizzling, evidence of an unnatural bridge, leaped across porcelain that had been scored deliberately. "Clear the hall," Isabela said, not shouting, and ushers who had never taken orders from a sovereign obeyed as if the line of her spine were a baton. The first lamps failed with a surprised little sigh. Then banks of light blinked to shadow. Across the court of honor, lamp globes tried to steady themselves like startled waltzers, and then failed entirely, plunging the white city into an impossible enemy dark midnight. The Ferris wheel, halfway through a revolution, held its breath. Gas jets along the promenade stuttered and took up the burden, too few and too far apart. A child screamed. Somewhere glass imploded. Somewhere else a violin kept playing, stubborn as hope. Tesla raised his voice for the first time that evening. Stay clear of the switchboards. There will be a cascade. He was right. Manual switchboards, manned by telephone girls and young men in waistcoats, who had trained for days to be crisp and invisible, began to meet a river of panic. Lines tripped. Relays chattered themselves into exhaustion. What should have been a local outage peregrinated, like a rumor. The Midway Plaisance went dark. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building dimmed to a monument of shadow. The great electricity building drew its breath and released it with a sound like disappointment. Cinematic moment one belonged to no camera yet invented. The white city, emptied of its white, a cathedral of darkness with the Ferris wheel, a fossilized moon behind it, and at its heart a ring of blue flame around a lone figure, Tesla, steadying the coil with one hand, while Westinghouse shouted to cut incoming feeds. In the ash-black cool, the faces of the crowd looked for custodians of order. They found Isabela. Send runners, she told her chamberlain, who had not expected to be employed as a lieutenant. Close the exits until we have a path. No trampling. Her voice came back to her, from the marble like a second, ghostly self, a rehearsal for a nation. By morning, every broadsheet between Dearborn and the lake outran truth. Sedition, state sabotage, screamed one masthead under a woodcut of a female silhouette that might have been any woman, and therefore belonged to all. Edison vindicated, AC a foreign menace, crowed another, with the unclean joy of a carnival barker who knows the ride is broken and will sell you a ticket anyway. Hearst accused the palace of throwing sparks to show dominance. Pulitzer accused the palace of hiding a tax to pay for poor men's light. Neither cared to wait for the commission of Peritos Independentes that Isabela had convened before dawn, or for the quieter truth that sabotage leaves fingerprints in frequency. Bankers along LaSalle Street took coffee with nervous sugar and began murmuring about liquidity and prudence. By 10, they had summoned the word panic with the lax piety of men who know how to profit from storms. This too had shape. Lines began at the doors of well-dressed institutions and grew down the sidewalk like infections. Isabela walked the Midway as if it were a corridor in her own house, and found the second scene waiting in the arcade cafe near the Ferris wheel. The crowd there was smaller, because the yellow press had pulled most of the city toward LaSalle, where fear performs better against marble. But the cafe had its own tragedy. Two men with too much hat and too little soul had overturned the coffee urns and dragged the small wooden till forward, leaving a parade of coupons scattered like confetti. Their coats carried the insignia of an electrical contractor that had bid, unsuccessfully, for a municipal loop. Their eyes carried the blazing confidence of men who believe the law loves them. The woman Isabela had noticed last night. Anna stood between those men and their demonstration, fists small but steady. One of them seized her wrist, wielding a rubber stamp with a grotesque flourish. He stamped her forearm in bright red, with the word "fraude" to laughter, the mark stinging more for what it proclaimed than for the ink itself. House policy, he lied, as if an arcade cafe were a courtroom and he a magistrate. The stamp blurred because his hands were sweaty. He called out to the watch, caught her passing false coupons, charge her or clear out. Isabella's guards had already flattened their hands on their sabers out of reflex. She lifted 2 fingers, and the gesture halted that familiar useless choreography. She stepped into the space as if into cold surf and said, in a voice built to be repeated, "Your cruelty ends here. Log the evidence. Name every switch and cable." The room stopped being a room and became a stage. The men sneered until she drew from her pocket, not a weapon but a notebook bound in black. She crouched, her dress whispering like leaves, and gathered the bright little coupons one by one. Each bore a number and a stamp, a kitten, a star, a burst of lightning. She asked Anna gently, "Yours?" Anna's chin lifted stubbornly. "I buy mine. I serve coffee. I mend sleeves. I don't mint light." "No," Isabela said, smiling with an irony that held pain. "That service is currently in dispute." She turned the coupons toward the window where gray daylight softened their edges. Even at arm's length she felt the forgery, the paper too slick, the perforations like teeth rather than thread. But what stabbed her was the watermark, a crown, not hers, but a cheap stamped mimicry implying sanction, and a serial letter, G, the signature of the rumor she had been shadowing for months. "Take these to the electricity building," she told her chamberlain. "Tesla will want their hum." The men Kapangas of the cartel, and too bold for their own long lives, tried to swagger past, but her guard did not need a drawn saber to be made of iron. "Detain them politely," Isabela said. "Sometimes politeness takes time." That afternoon the broadsheets burned through their stock. "Coupons of the crown," roared one, and if the punctuation might be joked about in calmer months, it looked like a wound now. A cartoon showed Isabela standing on a switchboard labeled State, dragging a lever with a smile that was not hers. Pulitzer's afternoon edition invented the phrase regime technico emergential before she had the chance, and then mocked her for what it imagined she would do. On LaSalle Street, bankers pretended to hold firm while quietly selling what could be sold. The word bailout flitted across lips the way prayers do when people forget what deity they've chosen. She convened Tesla and Westinghouse under the vaulted ribbing of the electricity building that evening, with the doors bolted and the windows watched. The place smelled of tin and varnish, and a recent panic sweat. She liked it that way. Truth often hides in clean rooms. The coupons, more of them now because she had sent runners to buy every false stamp in the Midway, lay on a table. Tesla stood in shirt sleeves, a wire behind one ear, the kind of man who forgets food but not a grievance. Westinghouse paced, a man who keeps his tempers in numbered drawers. "We've done a preliminary," Tesla said, fingers itching near his coil. "Sabotage leaves a frequency. This one hums with intent." He moved to the bench, set the coupons beneath a small induction coil, and the room filled with a high insincere whine. "Metallic ink wrong for currency," he said, "and the perforations reflect a gear we don't use here." He slid the coupons under a magnifier. "See? The letter G, cut not stamped." This was a deliberate mimicry of sanction designed to move through the fare without catching the untrained eye. "It preloaded blame, and it preloaded panic," Westinghouse added. "Whoever did this wanted a run on the banks as much as a run on the lights." Isabela pinched the bridge of her nose, then lowered her hand because leaders do not look tired. "We are not going to lurch from headline to headline," she said. "We will be exact. I am declaring a regime technico emergential to stabilize the grid, and I am appointing a Comisal de Peritos Independentes, your commission. We will audit every switchboard, every transformer, every ledger. We will publish what we find." Westinghouse's eyebrows lifted despite himself. "Publish? You think I should hide?" she asked with a half smile that cut. "I prefer to make my enemies hide." Night fell on Chicago like a curtain heavily dropped. On LaSalle,
Gentlemen muttered in the glow of gas lamps about the seizure of the market by a girl queen who did not understand capital. In boarding houses along Halsted and Wabash, women counseled each other in whispers about candles and raw milk and the virtue of keeping coin in the mattress. Hearst sent a reporter to count extinguished lamps as if darkness were a political party. Meanwhile, Isabela walked the silent court of honor and did not allow herself to cry. She rehearsed her sentence under her breath, because if she could say it in the middle of the White City, she could say it before the world. If light is power, then let it answer to the people. Her breath made a little fog in the air like a future she dared. In the morning, they held the public hearing at the music hall because the electricity building still smelled of hot grief. The audience arrived with faces made of newsprint and indignation. This too was ritual. The age demanded spectacles, and governance had permitted itself theatricality in self-defense. The dais looked like a courtroom had married a parlor. On one side sat Tesla and Westinghouse, all sharp angles and measuring glances. On the other, an attorney for a syndicate that would later insist it had no name. Isabela took the center chair, flanked by judges who had agreed to lend their solemn profiles to a moment bigger than any statute. Against the back wall, a rolling cart bore the disgraced transformer, its porcelain scored, a wound packaged for evidence. The first witness was not the transformer, but a man whose authority had been earned in a different crucible. Frederick Douglass rose with a cane and a certainty that carved a straight channel in the air. He had learned to fold a room to his will without raising his voice, and he did so now. He spoke of lights as more than lamps. He called them a social covenant. He reminded the commissioners that power meant little if it did not reach narrow stairwells and crowded kitchens. He saluted, almost imperceptibly, a young woman in the second row, Susan B. Anthony, who would later stand to make the room remember its daughters. Then he turned toward Ana Delgado, because the hearing had to measure something more intimate than voltage. "They stamped me as a fraud," Ana said, rolling up her sleeve to show the fading red word so every stenographer in the hall would have to write it. "I'll stamp every wire with the truth." The room was not allowed to applaud, but it did anyway in a rustle like paper learning to be water. Susan B. Anthony stepped forward next, a stooped grand lady with the eyes of a hawk, and made the case the law would soon have to hear. A regime technico-emergential, if it were to be decent, must not supply itself with pretext to crush the small. It must widen the light, not narrow it. She called the coupons evil, not for their forgery, but for their design. They were instruments that harnessed the crowd against its own interests. "You have the public," she told Isabela with a bow that was as much warning as honor. "Spend them well." Tesla's testimony was not a speech but a demonstration. He wheeled out the disgraced transformer and pointed, like a lecturer to a nervous class. He showed the grooves cut across insulators that would make an arc jump in conditions that should have been benign. He turned on his coil and made a line of light where its gilt openly. "Sabotage leaves a frequency. This one hums with intent," he said, and the sentence, given shape by the man who had first breathed it in a shuttered room, moved across the audience like a brand. Westinghouse, for his part, brought ledgers. They showed line loads and switchboard incidents, the handwriting of men who had lived through a dark hour suddenly becoming a script about motive. "We logged a spike in the Midway's feeder circuits exactly 7 minutes before the cascade," he said. "That spike was triggered by a remote shunt from a private substation we believe is tied to a consortium whose bids were rejected by the fair's board. The initials stamped on the coupons matched the internal code name for their project." "What code name?" Isabela asked, though she had a guess. "George III, Westinghouse said, and the sound of it was both a joke and a threat. The yellow press adored monarchy when it could be weaponized. The cartel had chosen a name that would smear by association. Rumor needed only a letter. Code had gleamed on counterfeit vouchers like an exhaled syllable. There was a rustle at the back of the hall as a man in perfect mourning stepped in. A gentleman whose philanthropy had roofed libraries and whose conversation had flossed the ballrooms from Boston to San Francisco. Sir Arthur Pembroke, chair of the National Lighting Trust, carried grief like a velvet cape. He had been Isabela's tutor in finance when she was 16. He had taught her how numbers could be taught to kneel. She did not let her face betray the warmth his presence had once kindled in her, because she was not 16 now and warmth was a liability. He bowed elegantly in her direction and put his hand on the transformer's cart as if to steady evidence from fainting. "This hearing is a farce," he said with perfect decorum. "Madam, I caution you, the market hears fear in your voice." Isabela stood very straight. "Then let the market learn a new music," she said, "one that holds a note of justice." He smiled like a man retrieving a chess piece. "You will ruin credit," he said softly, intended for her alone, though the room made a hush to drink her answer. "I'll pay the price of order so the nation won't pay the price of war," she said, and her chamberlain standing near the stenographer looked down to copy it exactly, because a sentence like that must go down as a nail in time. The commission recessed to deliberate, though in truth deliberation had already been occurring in the vault of the city's attention. Outside, LaSalle Street tried to rebuke the sky with its columns and failed. The run on the banks grew legs. Inside, Isabela stared at the transformer as if it were an animal and waited for it to confess. Tesla approached her with a gentleness that not all geniuses recall to possess. "You knew the name," he said, before Westinghouse said it. She nodded once as if acknowledging a debt. "I knew the rumor. The rumor had friends. Friends have names," he said. "Sometimes," she allowed, "sometimes they have codes." That evening, because scandal prefers twilight, the commission moved its benches into the Manufactures and Liberal Arts building, which the public had already forgiven for being dimmer. There, with the iron trusses like a forest of harp strings, Isabela read the emergency decree into the air. The regime technico-emergential would seize no factory and shut no printing press. It would map, meter, and audit. It would put a forensic ear to every switchboard in the city and then the nation. It would make a national grid of trust before it made one of copper. She named the commissioners, she named their powers and their limits, and then with a care that hurt named her own. She would not buy banks. She would not pay ransoms disguised as liquidity. She would instead use the palace to guarantee wages and warmth and to put inspectors in boots. And she would face their reports in public twice a week until the lights held steady. "If light is power, then let it answer to the people," she said at last, and the room, which had grown too used to oratory as weapon, recognized a vow. Cinematic moment too came cheap in film stock but dear in consequence. Isabela led a night raid not with soldiers but with engineers. They went in 2 lines, lanterns, notebooks. Tesla at the head like a saint carrying his own miracle. They descended into substation basements where the floor sweated and the air hummed of risk. They found a panel at LaSalle and Monroe where a relay had been bridged with a hair-thin wire soldered clever as a lie. They found a private loop feeding a printing press that spat coupons with a crown cut wrong in a letter G. Proud as a signature, Isabela lifted the stamp plate itself, a little empire of brass, and held it to the lantern's eye. "How many hands," she murmured, "does it take to make one coward?" In the days that followed, the yellow press tried to burn the city down with adjectives. Hearst ran a double-decker, crown coupons, pantomime monarchy. Pulitzer countered with a sermon on the danger of technocracy. But something else happened alongside the noise. People looked into their attics and found extra candles and then knocked on their neighbors' doors to share them. Foremen took the first hour at the switchboard and the last hour on the floor. Telephone girls in stiff collars who'd never been allowed to speak at a public meeting told the commission where the wires went and whose feet had trod too often near the wrong relay. Something like citizenship crept into the cracks where fear had been. Isabela ordered arrests, but not as the opera might have staged them. Half the men were too dull to bother with, the other half too clever not. The Kapangas from the cafe went to county jail to write letters to mothers who had never known the long words their sons favored. More interesting fish swam farther below the surface. The commission's audit reached the LaSalle Street banks, where ledgers recorded purchases of copper by Shell Enterprises and donations to newspapers that had discovered zeal for DC at precisely the moment it became useful. When the warrants rolled, they rolled quietly, and in the drawing rooms the wives understood papers better than the husbands. A corner of the city died a little in good ways when it realized its parties would be smaller. The final hearing turned into a stage big enough to hold all modernity's contradictions. Ana Delgado sat at the witness table in her only good dress, hair braided with a ribbon the color of coffee. Her hands needled dexterous colliers strongly on the table as if in a chapel. Isabela asked her to describe the moment she was stamped. Ana did so without flinching. The court recorder missed one comma because he had swallowed irritation and felt it stick. Susan B. Anthony closed her eyes and nodded like a woman hearing a note she'd known was possible but had never heard sung in public. Tesla waited, vibrating slightly as if the city itself had borrowed his pulse. "Who is George III?" a commissioner asked finally, and the room breathed in a hope that it would be a simple, king-sized villain. Isabela could have offered them one, but truth, like electricity, takes the path provided. She lifted a sheaf of letters seized from an office whose door had been opened with a key rather than broken with a boot. They were written in a hand she knew. She did not need to look for the signature because she could hear the sentences even before she read them. Sir Arthur Pembroke had named himself G30. Not because he yearned to be mistaken for a monarch, but because he liked to stand at the third position in any ledger, one removed from light. He had coordinated favors and fees and a rumor machine designed to make chaos feel like a policy option. He had not cut the porcelain with his own blade. He had not soldered the bridge wire himself. He had done what clever men do when they imagine themselves architects without blueprints. He had paid others to be his hands while believing that money washed intent from the soul. She called him to the front, a courtesy, and the room watched a gentleman approach judgment like a dancer pretending not to be winded. "You taught me to love the numbers," she said quietly, not to humiliate him but to mark the exact point of betrayal. "And you taught me to despise the mobs," he replied, a faint edge creeping into courtesy. "I tried to save you from them. You tried to save me from the people," she corrected. "There is a difference, and it will break your heart if you learn it too late." He looked past her into the crowd, then seeking allies. He found men recalculating, women tightening their lips, and a room that had chosen to remain lit. He lit them all with a gaze like a match that didn't catch. "You will end credit," he said, playing his last tired card. "No," she said simply, "I will end counterfeit." She nodded to the bailiff. When they collected him, he did not resist. He was already elsewhere in a memorandum where he had won. Cinematic moment 3 arrived without staging as they escorted him out. The disgraced transformer, positioned at the center so no one could ignore the culprit's arc, coughed a tiny arc. Everyone flinched at once. For a heartbeat, the building remembered darkness. Tesla stepped forward, placed a hand on the porcelain like a priest, consoling a dying parishioner, and the coil in the corner sang once, "I," and pure in a min of physics. The price came due, as she had promised it would. Isabela signed the Carta de Energia in the Court of Honor, where white columns could witness a compact better than any parlor. The Carta would establish a future national grid latched to no throne, owned by no bank, answerable in audits month by month. It would also limit her, and those who would inherit her, in ways that tasted like sacrifice. The palace would release its prerogatives over tariffs and bailouts. The crown would become a guardian of visibility rather than a wielder of switches. She made the parchment heavier with clauses than any monarch would prefer, and then read it aloud as if she were unsheathing something. There were boos from men who wanted kings only when they were villains. There were cheers from women who had never had a line read visibly in their name. Overhead the lights stuttered once, a wink rather than a failure, and then held. If light is power, then let it answer to the people, she repeated. And somewhere in the back row a girl began to cry because she had not known that phrases could belong to her. Ana's ascension did not look like a coronation. It looked like an appointment letter slid across a scarred oak table. It smelled like cold coffee and graphite. Chief Inspector of the National Grid, Isabela said, the words ringing with future as if struck from a bell. Begin at LaSalle and work outward. Stamp every wire with the truth. Ana's laugh shocked them both, not because it was rude, but because it was relieved. Ma'am, she said, I will make the hum honest. Tesla grinned, a lightning flash of human sunlight in a face built for storms. Westinghouse nodded solemnly and offered the maps an army general would have envied. The yellow press tried to metabolize a world where panic yielded to audits. Hearst found a way to print a heroic woodcut of a switchboard girl while sneering at regulation. Pulitzer let his editorial page evolve overnight into an ethic. Bankers on LaSalle discovered that the phrase commission of experts could live next to credit extension in a sentence without either word breaking. The city learned to love the sound of a window opening at night, a neighbor calling that the lights were still on, not as surveillance but as community. It was not utopia. It was something less photogenic and more stubborn order. Weeks later, at a small ceremony under a utilitarian arch rather than a glittering dome, Ana pinned her new badge to her dress before a crowd of seamstresses, dockhands, telephone girls, and men whose hands smelled of wire. The badge looked like the letter G, very slightly transfigured, curved into a lightning bolt, owned by no syndic but a public good. Isabela spoke quietly because every word had already been made into history and she preferred now to be local. Ana raised her hand, took the oath, and then laughed that relieved laugh again when a small boy in the front row shouted, "Fix the hum by our window." "Tomorrow," she said, "but I'll listen tonight." Only then, after ceremonies and sentences, did the twist uncoil, not to darken a victory but to give it a human cost that would not be trivialized by parade. Sir Arthur Pembroke, awaiting trial, sent a letter to Isabela in a hand that had not learned humility but had practiced remorse. He wrote that he had once believed her a bright instrument to be tuned by his hand, and that when the White City began to sing to itself he had panicked. Not at her power, but at his obsolescence. "I wish to be the conductor," he wrote, and forgot the music. She could have burned the letter. Instead, she returned it to the Commission's archive with a penciled note. "Remember this tone. The very first fraud is the one men practice on themselves."
In the months that followed, the Ferris wheel spent its evenings cutting a neat circle in a sky that had stopped flinching. The Midway resumed its holy frivolity. The Arcade Cafe rebuilt its urns and sold coffee at a discount to anyone who could produce an honest wage stub. And in the Electricity Building, where the dynasty of machines had once fought like stags, a small placard appeared near a transformer that wore a surgical scar along its porcelain. "Arc Volta like Sabotage Exhibit." It became a shrine of a modern kind. Lovers met there, pointing at the groove and whispering vows to keep their hands cleaner than their fathers'. Engineers put a finger on the glass and smiled, not with triumph, but with recognition of a problem that had yielded to honesty. On a late afternoon of that first winter with the Carta in force, Isabela walked with Tesla along the shore of the lake, both of them wrapped in coats that made them briefly anonymous. The lamps along the promenade were steady. Children tested ice near the edge, as if flirting with a dangerous suitor, and mothers scolded. "You have turned politics into lacquered copper," Tesla said wryly. "And you have turned electricity into religion," she answered. "Together we might survive our metaphors." He tilted his head, listening for a hum that did not arrive. "Sometimes the best sound," he said, "is the one we do not have to fix." She nodded. The crown felt heavier. It should. The Carta sat on her desk, like a promise that could not be amended without shame. She did not mind the weight. She only minded the part of herself, 16 years old, and bright, that had wanted to keep her tutor. "I'll pay the price of order, so the nation won't pay the price of war," she whispered again. Not to convince herself, but to tell the lake there was a covenant now. On the midway, the barkers learned a new pitch. Ride the wheel. See the city that taught the lights to serve. The sign was cheap. The sentiment was not. And if sometimes, late at night, when the machinery slept and the city exhaled, a transformer somewhere in an alley coughed a small, embarrassed spark, a girl with a badge would step from the shadows with a lantern and a smile and say, "It's all right, we've got you." Then she would listen for the frequency that told the truth, and somewhere in a townhouse on LaSalle, a man who had once placed money, like a general arranges infantry, would lie awake, hearing not coin but current, and understand too late that the age had decided what kings were for. In the end, the White City did not forget its worst night. It used it. Children would be told the story the way old villages tell of floods. There would be thumbs pressed to glass and wide eyes at the shape of the scar. There would be a sentence repeated in kitchens and union halls and Sunday parlors. A sentence the country had earned. If light is power, then let it answer to the people. And at every bedside where an oil lamp had been replaced by a little bulb that blinked like a hard-won miracle, someone would remember a woman in a shawl, stamped and stood back up, saying, "They stamped me as a fraud. I'll stamp every wire with the truth." The nation's heart learned a new beat, not DC and not AC, but a rhythm compounded of both. Steady, alternating between pride and vigilance, direct in its refusal to be used. When the age turned and the White City's plaster cracked, when the Midway learned new tricks, and the Ferris wheel went elsewhere, the grid remained, not infallible, not holy, but public, which had been the point all along.